This video is brought to you by Henson Shaving. In early December, 4 fighter jets escorted Vladimir Putin's presidential plane on a visit to the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. This was somewhat of a surprise, both because Putin rarely leaves Russia and because Russia-Saudi relations have been relatively rocky recently. So, it was even more out of the blue when a few days later, photos and videos emerged of Putin and Saudi Arabia's Prince Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS, shaking hands, laughing and smiling all around. So, in this video, we're going to take another look at Russia-Saudi relations, why they've apparently become best mates, and whether this newfound bromance is geopolitically sustainable.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos.
Now, for most of modern history, Russia and Saudi Arabia have actually had pretty tense relations. As the world's two largest oil producers, they were constantly undercutting one another in international markets, and Saudi Arabia's alliance with the US closed off the possibility of good relations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Post-Cold War, however, Saudi-Russia relations improved significantly, especially once they began collaborating via OPEC+. For context, OPEC is an international cartel of mostly Middle Eastern oil-producing countries led by Saudi Arabia that attempts to control global oil prices. In 2016, after a dramatic crash in the price of oil in 2014 and 2015, they invited other oil producers, including Russia, in order to better coordinate oil exports, forming OPEC+. Saudi Arabia and Russia are the biggest producers in the group, and together control roughly a fifth of all global oil production. Nevertheless, there have been a couple of hiccups in their friendship recently. They weren't too chummy back in March 2020, when Saudi Arabia flooded the market with oil after Russia refused to cut production along with the rest of OPEC+. Saudi Arabia retaliated by producing as much oil as possible, slashing prices. This was more of an issue for the Russians than the Saudis, because Russia's production costs are a lot higher than Saudi Arabia's. There was then another hiccup earlier this year when they agreed to cut production together, but Russia basically backstabbed the Saudis and produced more than they said they would, because Putin needed immediate oil revenues to fund his war in Ukraine. However, these events have just been bumps in the road for the budding friendship. In 2020, they managed to make up within weeks, and OPEC+ duly agreed a massive production cut representing almost 10% of global oil supply. Similarly, it didn't take them long to recover from the spat earlier this year. After a couple of months, Russia started mirroring Saudi Arabia's production cuts, and Putin and MBS seem to be closer than ever before. This raises the question, why are they getting along so well now? Well, as we see it, there are two key reasons for the strengthening of Saudi Arabia and Russia's relationship. The first being anti-US sentiment due to the war in Gaza, and the second, a changing situation in Ukraine. First, the war in Gaza. Essentially, the war in Gaza has strained Saudi Arabia's relations with the West, especially the US, pushing MBS closer to Putin. In the Arab world, anti-Americanism is at an all-time high because of the US's active support for Israel, and it's clear that the Israeli-Gaza conflict has scuppered the prospective normalization process between Arab states and Israel. MBS's reception of Putin earlier this month was a clear rebuke to the West, not least because MBS cancelled a planned visit to London to receive Putin instead. This is a continuation of a pre-existing trend. Saudi-US relations have been going downhill really ever since Biden took office, largely because Biden has been more explicitly critical of the Saudis' human rights record than previous presidents. In turn, this has been a boon for Putin because it's allowed him to avoid diplomatic isolation and distract from his illegal invasion of Ukraine. Next, the changing situation in Ukraine. Essentially, when Russia and Saudi Arabia fell out earlier this year, it was in part because at the peak of Ukraine's counteroffensive, Russia needed oil revenues immediately to fund its defense, so Putin decided to sell lots of oil. This obviously meant more revenues for Russia, but lower prices globally, which is what upset the Saudis. However, in the months since, the dynamics in Ukraine have changed. The front lines have stabilized, and the pace of advance on both sides has slowed. As Ukraine turns into what's sometimes described as a long war, the Kremlin's financial demands have changed accordingly. They don't need an immediate oil windfall. Instead, they need structurally higher oil prices in the long term to guarantee them a stable source of revenue to fund the next few years of fighting. Putin made this clear in his recent speech, where he reiterated that he had no interest in peace negotiations, and Russia is currently on track to increase defense spending by 70% next year. In short, Ukraine is now a long war, which means Putin wants higher prices for longer. This works great for Saudi Arabia, who also wants structurally higher oil prices to fund MBS's ambitious economic agenda known as Vision 2030, which essentially involves transforming the Saudi economy to reduce its overall reliance on oil. This is why, in their December meeting, MBS and Putin agreed to maintain their ongoing production cuts and urged all OPEC countries to follow suit. MBS is particularly happy to have Putin on side here because so far, Saudi Arabia has been having a really hard time pushing up oil prices, in part because the Americans are now producing more oil than ever before, which has put further strain on the US-Saudi relationship. Essentially, as Ukraine becomes a long war, Putin now wants structurally high oil prices, which means his oil-related interests align with Saudi Arabia, who also want higher oil prices in the long term in order to fund Vision 2030, even if, for both countries, that means a dip in short-term revenues. So how far can this budding friendship go? Well, as we see it, the future of the Saudi-Russia relationship depends on two things. First, the US. As long as Saudi-US relations remain strained, then there will be the political space for Saudi Arabia to have good relations with Russia. However, it's worth remembering that Trump and MBS had a very good relationship. So if he gets elected in 2024, or if MBS decides he needs to keep the US on side as a military guarantor during this time of geopolitical insecurity, then the space for a Saudi-Russia relationship will close significantly. Second, Iran. Iran has been Saudi Arabia's regional arch-nemesis for nearly 50 years. But since the war in Ukraine, Russia and Iran have become sort of de facto allies. Somewhat ironically, thanks to American military deterrence in the Eastern Mediterranean, Iran has been pretty quiet recently, so this hasn't really been an issue for Saudi Arabia and Russia. However, if Israel's escalating war in Gaza eventually provokes an Iranian reaction, then this disagreement could come to the fore, straining the Saudi-Russia relationship.
I've been using Henson's products for a few months now, and I really do recommend them from an economic, environmental, and shave perspective. Firstly, Henson's razors take entirely standard razor blades, which means instead of being forced to buy expensive replacement blades, including features you don't even need, Henson's razors cost about 10 cents each, allowing you to replace your blades more frequently and cut down costs significantly. Now, admittedly, the razor itself may cost more than other brands, but over the lifetime of the products, it quickly becomes a lot cheaper than buying all of those expensive replacement blades. This razor model is also better for the environment, with the Henson AL13 and all of its packaging being entirely plastic-free. Plus, unlike those expensive multi-blade upsells that other companies will push, even the blades themselves are plastic-free, helping to cut down on the over 2 billion disposable razors that are thrown away every year in the US alone. Finally, Henson's beautiful razors are precision engineered by an aerospace machine company who previously built parts for the Mars rover and the ISS, which means incredibly tight tolerances, high standards, and superb precision. And all of this combined means that while a single razor blade might sound scary, I've found it far easier to use than other comparable products, with a precise shave plane of about 0.0013 inches, offering a safe and perfect shave, while also minimizing the risk of ingrown hairs and irritation. So if you too want to try out Henson, then you can get 100 free blades with your purchase by clicking the link in the description, adding the razor and the blades to your basket, and then using our code. Thanks to Henson for sponsoring this video, and to you for supporting TLDR News.